Welcome to Nice and Blunt. My name is Adam Riancho, and it's time for another rankings video. This time we're hitting up top 50 wide receivers. And as I've done in every installment of my rankings this offseason, I go 10 players at a time. So here is a reminder on the screen of my top 40 at the receiver position. And if you want an individual breakdown of those guys, you can check out my previous videos on the channel. But we're going to move forward in the same tier as the last four guys. I have Diontae Johnson of the Carolina Panthers. And Diontae is really interesting because after his rookie year, he had 3 straight seasons with at least 144 targets. He was a volume machine. And it's not like he's a bad player. He knows how to get open. But for some reason, as soon as Kenny Pickett became his quarterback, he became allergic to the end zone. He scored 0 touchdowns in 2022 despite playing all 17 games, and last year he only scored 1 touchdown with Pickett. That was week 9 versus the Titans. But as soon as Pickett got injured, Diontae returned to the end zone. He scored 3 straight touchdowns in games with Mitchell Trubisky, and in 4 games with Mason Rudolph, he scored another 2 touchdowns in both Week 18 as well as in the playoffs versus Buffalo. So I don't think that he's not going to score touchdowns again. I think it was just Kenny Pickett who refused to get him the ball in the red zone. And there's an argument that this change in scenery for him is going to revitalize his career, or at the very least, his fantasy production. He was traded this offseason to the Carolina Panthers in exchange for cornerback Diontae Johnson, who according to PFF ranks 63rd at the position. So a starting corner, but not an elite one, and a pick swap as well, upgrading a 7th round pick for a 6th rounder. So it's mainly just to get Diontae Johnson's contract off the books, why they made this deal, in my opinion. But the Steelers definitely felt like Diontae was overpaid at $18.3 million on the final year of his contract at age 28. They had no intention to extend him. And I understand why he's been a diminishing player lately, missing 4 games in 2023, posting only 717 yards on 51 catches. He's seen a massive target share throughout his career, but has only surpassed 1,000 yards once in his 5-year career. On top of that, Arthur Smith does not value the receiver position, so it makes sense that they're just putting all their eggs in the George Pickens basket and adding a few pieces in the draft. I think he would have been a worthless fantasy option this year if he stayed in Pittsburgh. So overall, it's a win-win on all fronts, especially for us in fantasy. I think he's definitely more valuable as a Panther, where he's clearly their wide receiver 1. But it's just hard to say exactly how valuable that is going to be this season, because last year, Adam Thielen was elite for half the season. He averaged 13.5 points per game in his first 10 games, getting 9.7 targets per game, catching 7.6 receptions per game for 73 yards per game, and also scored 4 touchdowns. But it's not like there was a pulse in terms of other targets competing behind him. There was nobody else at all, and he inevitably did fall off a cliff at the age of 33. In those final 7 games, he only averaged 6.1 points per game without a single touchdown once Frank Reich was fired. So Thielen turns 34 in late August, and I'm not worried about him at all this year, but he is still there. That is another mouth to feed in an overall bad offense. I wish he was just off the team entirely. If that was the case, I'd be a lot more bullish on Diontae. But Dave Canales is the new head coach in the Panthers offense, and he was the offensive mind behind the breakout season for Geno Smith, as well as the resurgence for Baker Mayfield over the last 2 years. So if anyone can get Bryce Young on the right track, the argument is it's probably Dave Canales. And it's pretty obvious that Bryce Young will improve this season, but the bar is just so low that's not saying very much. And if Diontae Johnson can repeat the Thielen production, then Diontae, ranked here at wide receiver 41, is far too low in the rankings. But I have him in the same tier as guys I basically have top 35, so he could fall anywhere in this range behind Terry McLaurin. And I wouldn't argue with you at all if you wanted to put him as high as 35 above Jaden Reed. But I'm not quite ready to do that just yet, because there is a chance that wide receiver Xavier Legette, the rookie out of South Carolina that the Panthers traded up 1 spot into the first round to draft, does possibly take over as their number 1 guy when the season is over. So I'm not convinced that's going to happen. I do want to wait for training camp reports just to make sure that Legette is well behind Diontae in the pecking order, but he had a massive breakout season last year as a fifth-year senior. However, he was pretty much brutal, kind of irrelevant the first 4 years in college. It feels like a long shot that he's elite in year one. So I think it's pretty much guaranteed that Diontae is their guy. And at the moment, his underdog ADP is wide receiver 42, pick 70 overall. And in the late 6th round, you are absolutely drafting him at his floor. I think at worst, he would be exactly this bad, but there's a chance he's far better, and he's closer to wide receiver 30, if not higher, on the season. We saw Thielen put up top 15 numbers for a considerable amount of time. So I get it if you are way higher than I am on Diontae Johnson, but I just find it hard to like fully bet on the Panthers offense at the end of the day. The touchdown production, I think, is going to be very inconsistent, and he hasn't been good in that department overall the last 2 years. He could max out at 5 touchdowns this season. But he is going to be the wide receiver 1 for the Panthers. He's definitely the safety valve for Bryce Young this season, and I'm expecting 90 catches for about 1,000 yards and 4 touchdowns next season. I wouldn't be shocked at all if that was his stat line, and that's pretty much exactly what Adam Thielen got you last season. On a per-game basis, that would have been 10 points per game. Adam Thielen was the wide receiver 37 on a per-game basis last year, and that means you are 100% drafting Diontae at his floor. He feels bust-proof and a very safe pick. I'm just not sure that that upside is really going to hit. He would need to score at least 8 touchdowns to really unlock his potential, and if he did that, his numbers would only jump to about 11.4 points per game. That would have been tied with Jaden Reed, though, last year, which was wide receiver 25 on a per-game basis. So there's definitely room for improvement. Don't be surprised if I update these rankings and he vaults up by like 5 spots overall. I'm just waiting for the camp reports, and maybe, just maybe, he stays here, but it's also possible I view him in the exact same tier as Terry McLaurin. I wouldn't be shocked if Diontae was more valuable than Terry next season. Terry is my wide receiver 34 this year. So we'll see, but for now, Diontae, just my wide receiver 41. Next up, I'm shifting to a new tier, and there's a lot more pessimism regarding these players, but they're still valuable enough to give you solid flex production throughout the year. I'm just not fully convinced that they're going to be like weekly staples in your lineup, and ranking them outside the top 40 is less a reflection on them being bad players and more so emblematic of just how deep the position is at wide receiver this year. And we begin this tier with the 2 Tennessee Titans wide receivers, who I have ranked back-to-back and literally view as identical fantasy options this year in Tennessee. I have Calvin Ridley at 42 and DeAndre Hopkins at 43. Their stats last season were nearly identical as well. Both guys played all 17 games. Ridley got 136 targets. Hopkins got 137. Ridley caught 76 catches for 1,016 yards. Meanwhile, Hopkins caught 75 receptions for 1,057 yards. Ridley scored 8 touchdowns, and Hopkins scored 7. Ridley was tied last year for wide receiver 25 with 11.2 points per game. Meanwhile, Hopkins was tied for wide receiver 29, averaging 10.9 points per game in 2023. The Titans, meanwhile, are projected for a bottom 5 offense in terms of scoring this season. So in my opinion, there is no chance that either guy finishes the year as a top 30 wide receiver unless the other player goes down and misses significant time due to injury. But Ridley had a lot of target competition last year in Jacksonville. He actually saw fewer targets than the tight end Evan Ingram did, but he also played 6 games without Christian Kirk, as well as 3 games without Trevor Lawrence. Meanwhile, Hopkins was in a better situation in terms of target competition. He was by far and away their best option. The next best threat was tight end Chigokonkwo. However, it was still a run-first team with Derrick Henry, and Hopkins also played 9 total games with Ryan Tannehill at quarterback. That's definitely the worst of the 3, Tannehill, Will Levis, or Trevor Lawrence. So age definitely favors Ridley, who turns 29 in December, but he also spent a year away from football serving a gambling suspension in 2022, and he did not quite look the same last year in his first year back. On the other hand, DeAndre Hopkins just turned 32 years old, but is tracking for a Hall of Fame career, and it feels like he could still maintain his alpha wide receiver status for another season. But on top of that, their contracts have a $10 million gap between the two players. Ridley signed a massive 4-year deal worth an average $23 million per season with 2 years guaranteed. On the other hand, Hopkins is in his final year of his contract and he's getting paid $13 million per season, and the organization is far more invested in Ridley working out long term than they are in giving Hopkins another year as the alpha. Now, they both have to coexist in the Titans offense with quarterback Will Levis this season, trying to prove himself in year 2, and the team also gets a new coach, Brian Callahan, former Bengals offensive coordinator, and while this offense definitely projects to be a lot more pass-heavy this season with the departure of Derrick Henry, they also have 2 running backs who both finished top 10 in receptions last season, a combined 107 catches between Tony Pollard, 55, and Tyjae Spears, 52. In 2023. So there's a lot of competition here. It's kind of hard to exactly predict the target share for either player. And to further muddy the waters, veteran Tyler Boyd also joins this offense. He's going to play in the slot, and he's already fluent in Callahan's offense, dating back to those days in Cincinnati, but he's also going to turn 30 years old in November, and his contract isn't that significant. It's definitely not going to compare to the investment they have in Ridley and Hopkins. So there's reason for optimism with both of these players, but overall, I think there's a lot more red flags that contribute to both guys taking a big dip in production. And that's why I'm just not drafting either player this season unless I get them at a massive discount. In my view, they are both overpriced. Ridley's ADP on Underdog is wide receiver 35, pick 59 overall, and Hopkins is wide receiver 40, pick 68 overall. The nature of best ball makes them a bit more appealing for the spike week potential that they're going to offer when they find the end zone. But in redraft, I think it's going to be a massive headache deciding which weeks to start which one, and they're both going to be heavily reliant on touchdown production. I just don't see that being a consistent part of their game next season, given the fact they have to rely on Will Levis every single week. So I think you're going to get burned far more often than not. If Tyler Boyd wasn't part of the equation, I'd probably think their ADPs were fine, but that's just not the case. And that's why I think it's really going to be a big rotation between the two, and Boyd could be a big thorn in your side all year long. So that's why I recommend fading both Titans receivers and looking just elsewhere for receiver depth. There's a lot more reasons to be excited with players being drafted later. I think you should draft Ladd McConkey, Diontae Johnson, and Brian Thomas instead. Moving forward, though, at wide receiver 44, I have Keenan Allen, who based on ADP is probably my biggest bust candidate among all receivers this season. And it's not that I don't like him. I've been rooting for him on the Chargers for over a decade now, but it's just, I don't think he's going to be a focal point in this new Bears offense. We all know it's crowded. They have a quarterback we expect to be really good, but at the end of the day is still just a rookie. DJ Moore is in his prime at age 27, coming off a 96 catch season with over 1,300 yards and 8 touchdowns. And the Bears also drafted Rome Odunze, 9th overall, who compares to Justin Jefferson on Player Profiler and is arguably just as good, if not better, than Marvin Harrison Jr. and Malik Neighbors. I view them all in the same tier, to be honest with you. So this target competition is going to overwhelm what he's seen in LA with the Chargers over the last several seasons. Mike Williams was talented, but also missed 18 games over the last 2 years. And Keenan has been hurt as well. Allen has missed a combined 11 games in the last 2 years. And at the age of 32, entering year 12 in the NFL, my gut tells me the Bears drafted him more so to be a mentor for Rome Odunze rather than be a target hog and the alpha receiver in their offense. They only had to give up a 4th round pick in order to acquire Keenan Allen. They did pay him his $20 million salary along with a roster bonus this season, but they had a massive amount of cap space. They could afford to do that and still not make him a focal point in their offense. So I think that the majority of his volume is going to be front-loaded in the first 2 months of the season, and I expect the talented Rome Odunze rookie wide receiver to overtake him on the depth chart as the weeks go by, I think by the time we hit Halloween, Keenan will be their wide receiver 3. So if you do draft Keenan, I think he's someone you should be trying to trade high on and flip for a better option as the start of the season winds down. I think by the time you hit October, if you still have Keenan on your roster, he's going to be a liability sooner rather than later. Because every single week, his role is going to likely diminish, and at any point, it could flatline because he has by far and away the most injury risk of any Chicago Bear this season. His age and the target competition scare the hell out of me, and my belief in Rome Odunze is why I'm passing on his expensive ADP. He's being drafted as wide receiver 33 off the board, pick 54 overall on Underdog, and as my wide receiver 44, I think he should be going 2 full rounds later, if not even more. I understand that he was amazing last year. He was the wide receiver 4 on a per game basis, but that was with Justin Herbert at quarterback on a team with an atrocious defense that finished 5-12 and had major injuries to Mike Williams, Austin Eckler, as well as Josh Palmer. Quentin Johnston refused to step up, and Kellen Moore squeezed every ounce of production out of their only viable weapon on offense. So the situation this season couldn't be any more different, and it's far, far worse in terms of fantasy production. I refuse to believe that Keenan is going to pay off his 5th round ADP. If you do think he will, I think you're ignoring his age by a wide factor, and I think you have far too little confidence in Rome Odunze's talent. The only chance he has to come close to paying off his pricey ADP is if he stays healthy all 17 games. He would also need either DJ Moore or Rome Odunze to get hurt. That's very unlikely because DJ Moore never misses time and Odunze is only 22 years old. And Caleb Williams would also need to send him at least 7 or 8 touchdowns, and Keenan has scored 6 or fewer touchdowns in 8 of his previous 11 seasons. He is not a guy that offers a ton of touchdown production historically throughout his career. So I do not want to bet on him at all. I have him at wide receiver 44, 11 spots lower than his Underdog rank at number 33. And in my opinion, you should be avoiding him like the plague. One of these Bears receivers is not going to pay off at all, and I recommend you do not draft Keenan Allen. I think he burns you in 2024. Moving on to the final player in this tier, I have JSN at number 45 in my rankings, a player I was very excited about last year. He was 1 pick away from falling to the Chargers in last year's draft, but the football gods just refused to let us have nice things. Instead, he got a crowded landing spot in Seattle, and my Chargers sent their pick into the shredder and took Quentin Johnston 1 pick after him. So could you just imagine what value he would offer this season if JSN had been drafted 1 pick later by the LA Chargers? Oh, what could have been. But I digress. JSN is a Seahawk, and I expect a bit of a breakout for him this year under new offensive coordinator Ryan Grubb, just not one that makes him a true league winner. Ryan Grubb ran a top 5 passing offense in all of college football last year, and he's going to run the very same offense. We should be expecting a ton of 11 personnel in Seattle with Metcalf as the alpha, JSN as the 2, and Lockett as the 3. But ultimately, I'm not ready to fully commit to JSN just yet because I still have a lot of reservations about Geno Smith at quarterback. I still feel like he's going to hold them back, and that's why I did not predict them as a playoff team this season. They have a lot of talent, but I just don't think it's going to come to fruition with a rookie head coach and a college offensive coordinator that we've just never seen in the NFL. Another big reservation I have for endorsing JSN is the fact that Tyler Lockett is still a big factor in this offense. I just can't dismiss him just yet. Lockett is going to turn 32 in September, but he notoriously never gets injured. He's missed a total 3 games in his 9-year career, and he's also coming off his 5th straight season with over 100 targets. Last year, he had 122 targets in 2023. Even if that diminishes by like 25, 95, 97 targets is still a lot, and will definitely hinder JSN's production by a lot. I do think he's going to overtake Lockett, though. Last year, he started to come alive in the second half of his rookie year. He didn't miss a game, but he started the season coming off wrist surgery, and in his final 10 games is where he caught fire. He caught 40 receptions for 419 yards and 2 touchdowns, which isn't like incredible. Meanwhile, in those final 10 games, Tyler Lockett caught 44 receptions for 524 yards and 2 touchdowns. Lockett was still above him in this rotation. So JSN is at worst on equal footing as Lockett, and in year 2, it should be safe to assume that he will take a leap and overtake him. I just question by how much. I think they're both still going to be major factors in this offense, and with DK Metcalf as the clear alpha, there just might not be enough volume for JSN to really thrive, and I think the touchdown production will not be good enough to merit top 40 value at the position. If you believe in Ryan Grubb and Geno Smith a lot more than I do, then you probably think I'm too low on JSN this year, but I pretty much have him right in line with his underdog ADP, where he's being taken as wide receiver 45, pick 77 overall. I have him exactly at wide receiver 45. I think that's a reasonable price, but unless I'm trying to set up a DK Metcalf, Geno Smith double stack, I normally don't draft him unless he falls to me, and I consider Keon Coleman more valuable, and Keon is being drafted 1 pick later, so I usually go with Keon Coleman instead of Jaxon Smith-Njigba. I think he's a fine selection, but every time I have him on my team, I'm just kind of underwhelmed for his upside and potential. I'm ultimately not convinced that he will truly take off in Seattle until Lockett retires. But if I'm wrong, then maybe Geno Smith is that good. Maybe Lockett does suffer a significant injury for the first time and does miss plenty of games at the age of 32, but the odds of all of these things breaking the right direction for JSN just feel slim in my opinion, and I would be kind of shocked if he massively outperforms his ADP this year. So I'd rather be a year too late on JSN than a year too early, and that's why in the first year of Ryan Grubb's offense with a rookie head coach, I'm just not a full believer in the Seahawks reaching their peak, and I think next year, I think 2025 is going to be a lot more likely this season where JSN is a massive fantasy breakout. This year, I think I'd rather pass, but I have him exactly in line with ADP. I think he's fine if that's the best player available. Moving on to a new tier, though, I think there's potential league-winning upside with the last 4 players in this video. At number 45, though, is a guy that I have started to draft more and more lately. It's Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. The reason I'm warming up to him is because his biggest red flag might be completely irrelevant in 2024. He drove away from a car wreck this offseason when he was drag racing on the highway and caused a multi-car pileup, and that is definitely a big red flag. He deserves to be punished, but the NFL does not issue suspensions until after the legal system has made a final ruling, and this process seems to be taking a while to get resolved. I am no legal expert. I am just guessing, honestly. But the more time that passes where this issue is unresolved without a ruling, then the more likely it is that his suspension forces him to miss games in 2025 next season rather than this year in 2024. And if that is the case, then he's most likely the wide receiver 1 in Kansas City this year. So I would definitely be massively upgrading him in these rankings if that were to happen. But for the moment, he is obviously still behind Travis Kelce at the very least. There's no doubt about that. But other than Kelce, he's the only one who has pre-existing chemistry with Patrick Mahomes. I mean, Hollywood's new to the team and Worthy is a rookie. So I think there's definitely a path for him to offer league-winning upside if he does not serve a suspension this season. Last year, in the second half of his rookie season, he was electric. Since week 7, he started 8 of his final 10 regular season games, averaging 12.8 points per game on 7.4 targets per game, 5.8 receptions per game for 69 yards per game, and 5 touchdowns. An average of 12.8 fantasy points per game, ranked as wide receiver 17 on a per-game basis last year. So he was a league winner to close out the season, but I don't expect him to be that good this year because aside from Travis Kelce, the biggest target competition was arguably Mecole Hardman, and it's definitely a lot more difficult with Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy in this depth chart. But if you told me he played a full 17-game season this year, I'd probably upgrade him in the rankings to probably the George Pickens, T. Higgins, Amari Cooper tier. I think I'd probably have him right above Christian Kirk as wide receiver 30 in my rankings. I would expect him to be drafted in the 4th round on Underdog, and in the same range as Isaiah Pacheco, Travis Kelce, people would be trying to set up that Mahomes stack in the 5th. Right now, you can draft him as wide receiver 37, though, on Underdog, pick 59 overall, and that's just behind Calvin Ridley and Chris Godwin, 4 picks above Xavier Worthy. So his price has steadily been climbing. He was going about a full round cheaper not too long ago, but I am still much lower in my rankings because I just don't know for sure if that suspension is going to happen. I could 100% envision a scenario where he does start in week 1 and everyone thinks it's behind him, but then gets suspended mid-season by like 6 or 7 games and offers 0 value at all in weeks 12 through 17 if the suspension happens at the end of the year. That would be a worst case scenario. I think you'd rather have him miss time in the beginning of the year and have fresh legs for the final 2 months rather than miss the final 2 months of the season and get nothing from him in the fantasy playoffs. And the potential for that to still happen is why I am pumping the brakes and refusing to rank him higher than wide receiver 46 for the time being. But even if he does get suspended, 6 games is a very arbitrary number. It could be 2 games, it could be 4 games, it could be 8+ games. I really have no fucking clue. I just know for a fact he's going to get suspended. But again, it might not happen this year. It might happen in 2025. So if you are going to take a shot on him on Underdog, where you have a chance to turn $5 into like $100K, depending on the tournament, then by all means, go ahead and take him. I think that upside is undeniable, definitely worth taking a shot on. But if it's in your typical redraft league, I think he could be a big headache. I think the fantasy karma involved is also definitely a red flag. I think you can also easily win your league without him on your roster. I don't think he's a must draft in most formats. He's definitely talented, but his target share is 100% going to diminish this season regardless. And you also never know if Andy Reid is going to put him in the doghouse as a form of the team punishing him on his own for his behavior. Last year, they were desperate at wide receiver and really needed him to win games, but obviously he is immature. This year, they can afford to give him the Kadarius Toney treatment and leave him on the bench and just focus on Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy in this rotation. So they're still going to be favored to win the Super Bowl no matter what they decide to do with Rashee Rice. He feels a bit more like a cherry on top rather than an integral part of this offense this season, and that's why I am still only ranking him this low. But I could legitimately be 20 full spots too low in my wide receiver rankings on Rashee Rice this season, but the storm cloud that's looming over his head is just too murky to dismiss. And for now, in a regular redraft format, I am not targeting him on any of my teams. I trust that I can win without him. And I had the same thought process last year regarding Deshaun Watson, and that worked out perfectly fine. I will update these rankings in the coming weeks. If we get any news, you're definitely going to see this spot for him change. But until then, good luck if you draft Rashee Rice. Speaking of league-winning potential, though, call me a homer all you want, but Josh Palmer is still a tremendous value going off the board as wide receiver 51, pick 99 overall on Underdog. He is my wide receiver 47 this season. I hyped up Ladd McConkey as my number 31 receiver in a previous video, and literally all of the green flags in his situation apply to Josh Palmer as well. Say what you want about the Greg Roman offense. They're definitely going to be a run-first team, but the problem there is that they have no running backs you actually trust to be a bell cow. Maybe all 4 players combined for 40 rush attempts per game, but more likely than not, Justin Herbert is still going to dish out 30+ pass attempts on a weekly basis, and that volume has to go somewhere. Ladd McConkey is my bet to be the number 1 receiver and see the most volume, but that's actually not guaranteed. It could just as easily be Josh Palmer, and even if he's the wide receiver 2 like I'm expecting, there is a massive cliff behind him in terms of targets that you trust. DJ Chark is reportedly running ahead of Quentin Johnston. He did almost nothing last year in Carolina, and that means Palmer is likely on the field for 90% plus of their 2 wide receiver sets this season in LA. With no Keenan Allen, no Mike Williams, no Austin Eckler, or Gerald Everett, there is a combined 320 targets available from last year in the Chargers offense, and Palmer already had 61 targets in only 10 games last season. In my mind, he will undoubtedly go over 100 targets this season, and getting 100 plus targets from Justin Herbert in round 9 still feels like a diamond in the rough, if you ask me. Barring an injury, there's just no way Palmer doesn't work out. I think he's absolutely going to smash that ADP. I only have him ranked as wide receiver 47, so it's not like I'm leaps and bounds above the consensus rank here, but I honestly feel like I'm still too low. If you told me that Palmer has a better fantasy season than 2 of the Chiefs' receivers this year, I wouldn't be shocked. I have all 3 ranked above him. If you told me Christian Watson and Keenan Allen both got hurt and weren't as good as Palmer next season, that wouldn't be a shocker either. And if Keon Coleman or JSN struggle to take that leap, then I've already found 6 players I rank higher who could finish realistically behind Josh Palmer next season. So that would already upgrade him to wide receiver 41 overall if all of those scenarios happen. So if Josh Palmer does stay healthy, I'm already talking myself into the case that he should be ranked as a top 40 wide receiver if all of those 6 players do not perform up to my expectations. So I think wide receiver 47 is his floor. It's not beyond the range of outcomes that he does finish top 40. And it's not like we have to completely imagine what Josh Palmer can do when he steps into the wide receiver 2 role in the Chargers offense. If you look at the last 2 years in LA, Josh Palmer played in 16 games where either Keenan Allen or Mike Williams, if not both, were off the field. And in these 16 games, he had 126 targets, 81 receptions, 981 yards, and scored 4 touchdowns. That's an average of 10.2 points per game on 5.1 catches for 61 yards per game. That is a very consistent floor, at least 8.5 points per game, regardless of him finding the end zone. And last year, an average of 10.2 points per game, ranked as wide receiver 37 on a per game basis, ranking just behind Zay Flowers, George Pickens, Cortland Sutton, and Adam Thielen, who all put up 10.4 or 10.2 points per game last season. So it's hard to argue that Palmer's situation got worse heading into this year. If anything, it got massively better. And despite his ADP steadily rising over the last 2 months, I think it still hasn't risen enough. I think it should be going up even further, and that's why Palmer is one of my most drafted players this season. I've drafted him at a rate of 25%, a total 59 times in almost 250 drafts this year. I continue to be bullish on him. He's only 25 years old entering this season. It's the final year of his rookie contract, and he is very motivated to play well and set himself up for a big contract next year as he steps into the prime of his career. So I love Josh Palmer. I also love Ladd McConkey, but if he's not as good as I'm expecting, then we could potentially see a top 35 season from Josh Palmer if he is able to hold on to that number 1 status in this offense at receiver. I highly recommend you draft him this year. Next up in the ranks, though, at number 48, I have Curtis Samuel, who looks to be set up for possibly the best season of his career at the age of 28. He's entering his 8th NFL season. He's been in the league for quite some time, and the Bills moved on from Stephon Diggs and Gabe Davis, among others, which opens up a combined 284 targets available from last year's Buffalo Bills offense. They signed Samuel to a 3-year, $24 million contract with $14 million guaranteed. That's $8 million per season. And he reunites with offensive coordinator Joe Brady, who he played for in Carolina and put up his career best season up to this point back in 2020. In that year, Curtis was a very efficient dual threat player. He turned 97 targets into 77 catches. That's a catch percentage of 79%. He also had 851 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. He also ran the ball 41 times for another 200 yards and 2 touchdowns. So 77 catches, 1,050 yards, and 5 touchdowns is what he put up in 2020. And with all the volume available in this offense this year, I wouldn't be shocked at all to see those numbers repeat, because just 2 years ago, In Washington, he also had 38 rush attempts for 187 yards in 16 games. And for the last 2 seasons, he's seen 90-plus targets as well. He averaged only 635 receiving yards on 91 targets the last 2 years. But he was also playing with abysmal quarterback play in Washington. So getting the upgrade to Josh Allen is going to be a massive boost to his efficiency in 2024, and that's why 1,000-plus scrimmage yards and 5-plus touchdowns is not an insane projection for him this season. I do think it's a bit optimistic, but still, it's in the range of outcomes. In that 2020 season with Joe Brady, Curtis Samuel averaged 11.5 half PPR points per game in 15 games, which last year would have been tied with Jaden Reed for wide receiver 25 on a per-game basis. The ceiling is there for Curtis Samuel to be a league winner. However, given he's a bit older, let's say Samuel is able to put up the same total numbers across 17 games, and this optimistic projection of about 70 catches, 1,000 yards from scrimmage, and 5 touchdowns would average approximately 10 points per game, which last year was wide receiver 37 on a per-game basis. The same optimistic outcome I just brought up for Josh Palmer. So that's why I have the two ranked back-to-back. I view them identically this year, and this wide receiver 49 ranking could be way too low if that ceiling does hit. There's a world where Josh Allen sends him 9 or 10 touchdowns this year, and all of a sudden makes him a top 30 wide receiver in this offense. So with an ADP of wide receiver 49, pick 88 overall, I still think you're drafting Curtis Samuel at his floor. I think he's a very safe investment with a lot of upside. Recently, he was going outside the top 100, but his price has been steadily climbing. He's now pick 88 overall. So I still think he has room to go up and still offer good value. I'm fine drafting him at his current price. The upside is undeniable, and the floor, I think, makes him pay off at worst at this ADP. But at number 49, right behind him, I have Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. You can probably notice a theme here in this tier. I have receivers in elite offenses that I think might be a little undervalued overall. But he has still never really done anything in his career from a fantasy perspective, but the last time we saw him was the best game of his NFL career. In the NFC Championship game, he torched the Niners in the first half for 2 catches, 25 yards, and a touchdown, as well as a 42-yard rushing touchdown, a total 19.7 half PPR points in that matchup. But aside from that game, there's really nothing else to point to in the past that makes you confident in Jameson Williams. As a rookie, he missed the first 12 weeks of the season, recovering from a torn ACL. And in the 6 games that he did play, he only had 1 single catch, which was, albeit a 41-yard touchdown. That was his only catch as a rookie. And in year 2, he missed the first 4 games due to a gambling suspension that was the result of an ambiguous policy that personally I'm not holding against him. I don't think he's just like immature. I think he just made a mistake and it's okay. I think he learned his lesson. I don't expect that to happen again. But despite his first round draft capital, he was never able to surpass Josh Reynolds on the depth chart last season. And he has never been able to go over 8 fantasy points without scoring a touchdown in his 18 regular season games. Not counting the playoffs, he only has 3 career games with over 3 targets. And in one of those games, he did get 6 targets, but also put up a bagel. He did not catch a single pass in week 7 at Baltimore last year. But their entire offense was shit. I think you can throw that game out overall. If you're optimistic about Jameson Williams, then you're really just assuming that he figures it out. There's really nothing tangible to point to that says he will be successful in the NFL, aside from that 49ers game in the playoffs. But there are a few reasons to believe that you don't need to care about any of that and that you shouldn't be writing him off just yet. After all, neither of his first 2 seasons had ideal circumstances given the ACL and the suspension. He was elite in his junior year of college. He did nothing at Ohio State, but he was competing with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and JSN those first 2 years just for playing time. So he decided to transfer to Alabama, where he caught 79 receptions for 1,572 yards and scored 15 touchdowns with Bryce Young as his quarterback. It is worth noting that John Mechie was the team's best wide receiver before getting injured himself, but these numbers are very impressive. They speak for themselves. He is still only 23 years old, and at 6'1", 180 pounds with 4.39 speed, the Lions ultimately did trade up to draft him, pick 12 overall in 2022. There were plenty of reasons to do that. So with their recent track record of drafting elite college talent, I think it's hard to argue with their decision making. If anything, you should probably believe that it will pay off inevitably. But if it's not going to happen for Jameson Williams this year, it might not happen at all. Not only did Josh Reynolds leave the team, he's now a Denver Bronco, opening up 64 targets in this Lions offense, but Detroit opted not to draft a single wide receiver in this year's draft, which was very deep at the position, signaling that they do believe in him, and all signs point to him having the number 2 role in this offense all locked up. It's probably a bit less valuable in Detroit than the average team, however, because Amon-Ra St. Brown is still going to command over 150, 160 targets. Sam Laporta probably jumps up to 120 targets this year. And behind the league's best offensive line, Detroit is still a run-first team with Jahmyr Gibbs, an excellent pass catcher as well, alongside Dave Montgomery. So in reality, we're looking at the 4th option at best in this offense, but it's still projected to be a top 5 scoring offense in the league, and making the bet on Ben Johnson's play calling is a recipe for success at the end of the day. So while you can still be a non-believer when it comes to Jameson Williams, if you're wrong, it could be a massive mistake to bet against him this year. And that's why I think his ADP of wide receiver 48, pick 85 overall on Underdog, is really not that risky at the end of the day. I do prefer Josh Palmer and Curtis Samuel going later, but if you think I'm too low and rank him above those guys, I don't fault you at all. I think you have a case to be made that that is what I should be doing. I understand you have to pass on some pretty good running backs in that range of the draft to get him, but there's still some really good running back values all throughout the draft going later. And while I'm not expecting the world from him, he could easily score 8+ touchdowns in this offense. And if that happens, he's going to fly past a top 50 finish at the wide receiver position. So Josh Reynolds did offer several weeks as a viable flex play last year. He scored 5 touchdowns of his own, and he is nowhere near the athlete that Jameson Williams is. So it might not be a guarantee to hit every week, but at this point in the rankings, it's hard to find more upside, and it's easy to envision his path for success working out. I think he's a fine investment where he's going, but if you want to pivot to some safer options I have ranked lower, I wouldn't blame you at all. I think Josh Palmer is a better use of your pick, straight up, in my view. But that might just be my Chargers bias talking. Jameson Williams could definitely outperform him this year. But at number 50, we have the final player of this video, yet another wide receiver in this tier who made a dumbass decision and made headlines behind the wheel of a car for all the wrong reasons this offseason. It's Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. Addison already felt poised for negative regression this season. He was terrific in fantasy last year, finishing with 108 targets, 70 catches for 911 yards, and 10 touchdowns as a rookie. But it was truly a tale of 2 seasons. He was elite for the first 8 games. Kirk Cousins was his quarterback. Justin Jefferson got injured week 5, setting up Addison as the alpha wide receiver for 3 weeks. And even when Jefferson was healthy, alongside TJ Hawkinson, he was putting up great fantasy numbers. Addison scored 7 touchdowns in those first 8 games, an average of 13.5 points per game in half PPR. But as soon as Cousins tore his Achilles, Addison fell off a cliff. In his final 9 games of the year, he was lucky enough to score 3 touchdowns. But aside from a game week 15 against the Bengals, where he caught all 6 of his targets for 111 yards and 2 touchdowns, his numbers were dog shit. He averaged 8.7 points per game, including that 26-pointer against the Bengals. And if you take that game out of the equation, his average was only 6.5 points per game when Josh Dobbs and Nick Mullins were his quarterbacks. So when Kirk Cousins left Minnesota this offseason, it was safe to assume that all of Addison's fantasy value left with him. But I am someone who believes that Sam Darnold is better than most people give him credit for. He's not amazing, but the bar for him is just so low. I think he's been completely written off by most people, and that is too harsh of a position to take. I was also optimistic that his target share would stay the same, if not possibly increase, because TJ Hockenson did suffer a torn ACL in late December last year, and for at least the first 2 months, I think TJ Hockenson would have been on the PUP list, and that means Addison would not have had to compete with him at all for targets. Hockenson had 127 targets last season in 15 games. So even with Justin Jefferson healthy, there was an extra 8.5 targets per game that needed to be allocated to other players. And I was starting to believe that Addison offered compelling upside when he had a 6th round ADP. I was actually taking him quite a bit. But in the last 2-3 weeks, he's been falling like a rock due to the DWI charges that cropped up when he was found drunk on the side of the road not far from LAX airport in his car. Not only is this a terrible look given that one of their teammates just passed away due to a drunk driving accident, but this is the second offense regarding Jordan Addison behind the wheel of a car. Last year, he was cited going 140 miles per hour in Minnesota, allegedly trying to take his dog to the vet in an emergency. But last year, he served no suspension for that issue. Meanwhile, this year, the penalty feels locked in, given he is a repeat offender, and the league usually takes this pretty seriously. So at least 2 or 3 games feels like a guaranteed suspension. It could be more, given it's the second time he's had a problem while driving. And if that suspension comes in the first few weeks of the season, then it completely negates the upside that TJ Hockenson's absence would have led to in terms of target share. So now I think he might as well be off your board completely until we have a clear picture of what's going to happen, because it's not like he's injured. You can't put him on IR. He's just going to clog up your bench while you wait for him to get back. And once he does, the team might be losing so bad that Darnold gets benched for JJ McCarthy, and now you're looking at a 6.5 point average in terms of fantasy points for Addison with one of the youngest rookie quarterbacks we've ever seen, who never got massive reps in college and feels destined to be overwhelmed in his first season as a pro. So if he's not going to be the clear number 2 weapon in this offense the first 5 weeks of the season, then what are you even getting from Addison? I have to rank him, but even at number 50, I feel like I might be too low. But just like Rashee Rice, there is a scenario, albeit slim, where he does not get suspended, and that doesn't happen until next year. And now there's no dip in production from Addison, and he does offer some potential league-winning upside. I don't think it's wise to bet on that, but there is a sliver of chance that it does happen, and this ranking will be updated in the coming weeks as we get more clarity. But if it is going to change, expect it to go down a lot further. I highly doubt this ranking is going up, and that's why you might as well just not even consider him as a player to target in your draft this season. Wide receiver 50 kind of feels a little bit optimistic for Jordan Addison. So that's it for this video, my top 50 wide receivers. But in the final 2 tiers of my rankings, I have at wide receiver 37, Marquise Brown, followed by Xavier Worthy, Rome Odunze, Keon Coleman, Diontae Johnson, Calvin Ridley, DeAndre Hopkins, Keenan Allen, and JSN. You can argue for any of those players as high as number 37 in the rankings, but also as low as wide receiver 45. And in the final tier of this video, I have elite upside opportunities with also some potential league losing values in Rashee Rice at number 46, followed by Josh Palmer, Curtis Samuel, Jameson Williams, and Jordan Addison. Those are my top 50 wide receivers this season. I will be updating these rankings in the next few weeks. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button for me and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And I will see you in the next video. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.